Welcome to the first Tempo Storm Meta Snapshot Breakdown of the new year. Descent of Dragons has been out for nearly a month now, and different decks continue to pop up. Even in a meta that has been mostly refined, developments continue to be made, and it becomes more clear as to what decks really are the powerhouses of the format. Tier 1 has thinned out, leaving it to have fewer decks in it than previously. This is partly due to decks being refined to better perform in specific matchups, and partly due to players realizing what decks truly are the best decks. On top of this, there will be balance changes coming in the near future, which will change up the meta heavily again. Are new decks performing better than older ones? Is Anubisath Rogue still the deck to beat? Join us as we take a deeper look into the latter meta. Before we begin though, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with our Hearthstone content. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at Tier 1. Leading off Tier 1 this time around is a new addition to this tier, Highlander Rogue. Previously in Tier 2, this archetype has proven lately to be more than a fad. Making good use of Zephyrus the Great, alongside Rogue's powerful class cards, this deck can beat the best decks on ladder with ease. Naturally, Highlander decks are really powerful if the class can support it with good class cards, as the Highlander payoff cards are so strong. Rogue is no exception and has one of the best sets of cards, making it a natural fit for these Highlander type cards. Highlander Rogue does well against slower decks such as Highlander Mage. These types of matchups give the Rogue time to accelerate into their own game plan, whereas aggressive decks such as Galakrond Warlock are typically too fast for the Rogue. Next up in Tier 1 is Galakrond Shaman. Many players think this archetype wasn't nerfed heavily enough, and it seems they may have been right. The archetype finds itself in Tier 1 as the meta settles in. The archetype is powerful and continues to do broken things. Many aggressive decks will instantly lose to Dragon's Pack, while slower decks struggle to compete with Shutterwalk. This archetype does a lot of things well and is keeping the meta locked down. As you'd expect, this deck does best against Highlander Mage, as the archetype has a difficult time competing with all of the Shaman's tools. As for bad matchup, Galakrond Shaman struggles against decks such as Tempo Rogue or Galakrond Warrior, as these decks can go head-to-head with the Shaman in both pressure and burst, making it hard for the Shaman to find the time to relax and assemble its win condition. Make no mistake though, even the bad matchups with this deck find themselves close to a 50% win rate. The last deck we'll be taking a look at within Tier 1 is Galakrond Warrior. This archetype was originally known as Tempo Warrior, but is now referred to more commonly as Galakrond Warrior as it builds around this card. Galakrond Warrior aims to pressure the opponent out in the early turns and then attempts to close out the game using burst. What makes this archetype so strong is that ability to mix aggressive and defensive tools so easily without suffering much punishment. You have the tools to deal damage to your opponent, the ability to fight for board, and even the option to generate more value when needed. This warrior archetype does best against Galakrond Warlock thanks to all the tools the warrior has to interact with the board. It's very hard for the Warlock to build a board for long enough to push damage. As for bad matchups, either Anubisath Rogue or Tempo Rogue can prove to be difficult. It can be hard to deal with the consistent pressure these decks have. Even when you make it through the early turns, they often can close out the game with burst. This time around, Tier 2 features more decks than the previous tier, but not by much. This tier features the decks that are powerful in the current meta, but fall a little bit short of the first tier. There are currently 4 Tier 2 archetypes. Let's jump right into the one leading this tier. The first deck you'll find in this tier is Tempo Rogue. This archetype is the second best Rogue deck, coming in behind Highlander Rogue. Tempo Rogue makes use of Rogue's powerful class cards while also borrowing the Necreum package from Anubisath Rogue. One key difference between Tempo and Anubisath Rogue is the choice to run an additional Death Rattle minion in the Tempo-based archetype. While this archetype doesn't have the same burst as the other variant, it does better when it doesn't draw Necreum Apothecary, making it an overall more consistent deck. One of Tempo Rogue's best matchups is against Highlander Rogue, and one of its worst is against Galakrond Shaman. This archetype wants to be the aggressor and can fall flat in matchups where it's slower than its opponent. Next up in Tier 2 is the previously mentioned Anubisath Rogue. This archetype was at the top of the meta previously, mostly thanks to the power of Necreum Apothecary when combined with Anubisath Warbringer. As the meta shaped itself around this deck, several archetypes began to target it, leaving the meta much more aggressive. This is the main reason the archetype fell from grace, but it definitely was proven to be slightly overrated as time went on. Make no mistake though, this archetype is still a threat and should be treated as such. This rogue variant performs best against really slow decks that have virtually no way to deal with the massively overstated minions, such as Highlander Mage. On the other side of the matchup chart, this rogue deck has difficulties against hyper-aggressive decks, such as Galakrond Warlock. The first non-rogue archetype we'll be looking at within this tier is Highlander Mage. Highlander Mage is an archetype built around the Highlander payoff cards. This archetype plays similarly to Pocket Galaxy Mage, aiming to control the board early while slowly developing large minions to out-pressure the opponent. Descent of Dragons introduced a lot of powerful cards that gave this mage archetype the ability to compete within Tier 1. Highlander Mage can struggle against some of the decks with a lot of consistent pressure or value, such as Galakrond Shaman or Anubisath Rogue. It excels against pure aggro decks, such as Galakrond Warlock, due to the ability to constantly remove their board and exhausting their opponent of resources. The last deck we'll be looking at within Tier 2 is Galakrond Warlock. Don't let the name confuse you, this archetype is essentially just Zoo Warlock with an invoke package. This variation of Warlock is perhaps the strongest Zoo has been in a very long time. Invoking Galakrond as Warlock summons two 1/1 demons, giving you a way to swing the board consistently. On top of that, Warlock has some insanely strong invoke synergy, which all fit Zoo Warlock very well. Galakrond Warlock has a really good matchup against all of the top rogue archetypes, but performs best against Anubisath Rogue, as it lacks an efficient way to constantly deal with the Warlock's board. As always, this type of Warlock deck can have a difficult time against decks with access to constant board swipes. Both Highlander Mage and Galakrond Warrior simply have too many ways to deal with the board, leaving the Warlock to often fall flat. It wouldn't be a Meta Snapshot Breakdown without us giving you a deck that we think is well suited to counter the meta. As always, when there are more than 2 decks in the first tier, it can be hard to target them all, so we're going to give you a deck that does very well against the first 2 decks in the tier. The deck that we suggest to play in order to counter these 2 decks is Face Hunter. This archetype was much higher on the last Meta Snapshot Breakdown, but as the meta changed, the deck began to struggle more and more. It struggles against a lot of Tier 1 and Tier 2 archetypes and can be inconsistent at times, but one thing is for sure, it beats both Highlander Rogue and Galakrond Shaman. This archetype can apply so much pressure and can easily ignore both of these decks' minions, allowing you to close out the game extremely early. Dragon's Pack often proves to be the bane of aggro decks, but luckily for Hunter, it can just hero power and use burn to close out the game while ignoring taunts. We think Face Hunter would be a solid choice for ladder right now, so if you're looking to gain an edge, try it out and let us know in the comments how it does for you. Descent of Dragons certainly shook up the metagame and continues to see new developments every day. It'll be interesting to see what cards are touched upon in the upcoming balance changes and how the meta will look afterward. Thank you for watching our Meta Snapshot Breakdown. We hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to keep up with our Hearthstone content. See you next time!